So today what we're going to do right now is we're going to study a thing called collecting and analyzing data. So the reason why we're doing this is because we're talking about specific things, surveys, right? Now, the surveys have questions that we use to get that information, right? So when you're going out and you're the person who collects that survey, you have a primary source. So that's one that collects their own information for their own use. Now, there is a way to collect information when you have a massive one. You as a person, if you were doing a massive survey, couldn't visit every person in your survey. So what you do is you get some people to help you, right? And that we call a secondary source. Now, when we go to all these people and we create questions for our surveys, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it so the survey questions aren't leading, aren't biased. Okay? Now, let's go over all of the different types of biases that you can have. Okay? In your survey questions. All right. So a parent study is conducted to learn if an after-school program should be offered. Okay. Now, the survey question reads, every musical training helps develop brain ideas involved in language and reasoning. Should the school offer an after-school program for music? Now, let's take a look at this. They're saying we're going to go and explain why this question may result in response bias. Let me explain it to you. Okay? Let's break down the sentence and kind of look at the sentence and see if there's something that kind of seems wrong about it. And I'm going to tell you that it has to deal with this one line. Pause the video and think about why this question is a bad question. And can you tell me why? Okay, here we go. The characteristic that I'm highlighting here is the first sentence increases the chance of you being influenced or change how you think about what they're asking. Okay, so it says every musical training helps develop an improved language and reasoning. So that's great. Isn't that great, kids? Isn't that great? So do you think that the school should offer a music program? So it's kind of like you're telling them what you want them to do as the surveyor. You're telling them why something is good, and then say, hey, what do you think? Should we have a music program? Well, that's the characteristic of what we call a response bias. The opening sentence basically increases the probability of the person changing what they're thinking in favor of the music program in this case, right? So when you hear the term response bias, we're actually talking about responses that are biased because of leading information. That underlined portion of our sentence is leading. It kind of tells the person, kind of gives the person a reason as to why something is good, when really all we want to know is, based on what you already know, do you actually want to have a music program for your school? But by putting that underlined red thing, it makes you choose what they want. So just copy that down. Now, the next thing that I want to ask, can we make the question better? So think about it and then come back to me. So the key is to look at the first question. sorry, the first question. And that first sentence is the most important thing. The key idea is to basically just remove the first sentence. And then you're going to have this. Should we have an after-school music program? And by doing that, you're not leading the person on. You're not telling them what you think is good by actually giving that description that we had at the beginning. So in order to get response bias removed from a sentence, from a survey, what we want to do is we want to find that thing that kind of gives an idea before we ask the question. Okay? All right. So let's move on to the next concept. So let's look at a thing called measurement bias. There's got to be a reason why we have measurement bias. Let's take a look at this question. Survey question. Ferd wrote this survey. Who do you think is the best female tennis player of all time? Martina Navratilova, Chris Evert, Billie Jean King, Serena Williams, or other? All right, so when we look at these listings of all these amazing players, right, you got to understand that tennis has existed for so long, right? So you got to ask yourself, one of the weaknesses that we actually see in this survey is when you ask this question, are these the only amazing tennis players that we have? Clearly, when you think about it, there are many more players to choose from. So these female players could be Bianca Andreescu, a great Canadian player. Maybe Canada's Leila Fernandez, the lady that got to the final of the US Open. And I think Bianca Andreescu had actually won a major tournament as well, right? But these are just Canadians. And heck, what about her sister, Venus Williams? At one point, Venus was one of the greatest players on the planet, okay? It does seem unfair to me that not all these other players are there, right? So it is unfair that those players aren't listed. So this definitely isn't a fair question. It's very similar to that phone question that we talked about in the first lesson, where we had all of the people listed, but the first person on the list in our phone call was the one everybody would default to because they had to listen to the other choices. But this one, with only having these four, guess what? We cannot say that this is a nice question. Therefore, we have this thing called measurement bias. And measurement bias is defined as this. We're going to think of measurement bias where you have a list of materials or a list of choices, but not all the options are listed. Not all of the possibilities are listed, and that is how we define measurement bias. So now let's take a look at this problem here. We're going to look at the concept called non-response bias, okay? So when you hear the concept of non-response bias, we're actually talking about something where there isn't enough responses to make a nice sample, okay? Or a nice representation of what's actually happening out there in the world. So let's read through this example here. Okay. At a new restaurant, every fifth customer was asked to complete a questionnaire about customer satisfaction. About 30% of the customer survey actually bothered to fill out the questionnaire. Ooh, that's a problem. Okay. And the majority of the customers who filled out the questionnaire compared about poor satisfaction. Okay. The manager concludes that their wait staffs and cooks really must suck. Is the manager's conclusions reasonable? Let's do the math for that, okay? So let's go and take a look at what all of this means. The first thing that I want you to recognize is that it says that every fifth person gets chosen. Okay, so we're doing a systematic sample. So every F person gets chosen, right? So what does that represent? 1/5 represents 20% of the people surveyed. And we're going to make a big chart and some calculations to make sense of this. So the key is 1/5 or 20% of all the people are surveyed, right? But let's go and do some more math here. So if 1/5 of the people are surveyed, right? Let's go and see what all those numbers mean, which we're talking about. We're trying to find out who were actually happy. So let's read the second sentence again. It says about 30% of the customers actually bothered to fill out the questionnaire, right? The majority of the customers filled out the questionnaire were also complained about poor customer satisfaction. So let's quickly talk about the majority of people that we were surveying. The deal is 30% of all the people that we have here, 30% of the 20 that actually surveyed gives us about 6%, doesn't it? Which is just 0.3 times 20%, which gives us 6%. Now, that tells us the following. That tells us right away that of the 30%, of the 20% that had been surveyed, the majority of the 6% that we had were not happy. So that's where this part comes into play, right? So of the customers that filled in, that's what happened. So that's interesting. Now, let's continue talking about the rest of this, right? And so let's continue. So remember, 30% had actually bothered to fill it out, right? That means 70% did not, right? Now, 70% of the 20% that we originally started with tells us we only have about 14%. And of these 14%, was it because that they were unhappy? We don't know. Maybe, but we don't know. Now, let's consider the rest of the group. Okay, let's just zoom out a bit so I get some more space. And now, since we have this, right, think about the last bit of people that were in the survey, right? So originally, we had 20% of people, right? That means we have 4/5 or 80% of people that hadn't done the survey. So that tells us 4 or 5 or 80% of the people were actually not surveyed, right? So the last question that I want to answer is this. If that was the case, right, what the heck does that mean? Does that mean that these people sucked? I'm not sure. Let's answer that in this last graphic. All right, so here is what's happened. In the last 80% of people, you have to think of it this way, that they were never even surveyed. And that's a lot of missing information, right? Here is the thing that the manager knows. The manager knows that there was literally, from the first box of information that we have here, that less than 6% of the customers were not happy, right? That's not very many, is there? Right? And we know 70% of those 70% of those who were surveyed didn't respond. Now the question is, were they unhappy and just couldn't be bothered? We don't know. And neither does the manager. Finally, here's the other thing you know. 80% of the people didn't even survey. Didn't participate in the survey. And since they didn't participate, this is a massive number, right? So let's continue. There's some crazy math here that kind of makes you realize that this was a ridiculously bad survey. In fact, this is what you need to remember. I'm putting this in black here. So here's all the people that didn't survey. Here's all the people we didn't know about. So people we don't know, right? You know nothing about from, well, the first 80%. So that comes from the people that weren't surveyed, plus 14% of people who couldn't be bothered. So that gives us a whopping 94% of people we know nothing about. Okay? So we need to be very careful about making conclusions. All right? So this is really a bad concept, right? So here are some improvements. Let's go over it. First thing you realize is that you can't make any decisions about 6% of the population. So this non-response bias that we talked about is the fact that people aren't responding, so we have no concept of what the heck is going on, right? And that is what non-response bias is. So now let's talk about the possible improvements that could be made for this thing, right? Possible improvements based on what we know. The survey could take more than 1 in 5 people. Why not everybody? It is only one store, right? So why not? The other thing that you could do is you could find out why the non-responders didn't respond. So you could actually have to go back up to this block of people that didn't respond. So if you knew who they were, you could ask them, why didn't you respond when you were given the chance for the survey? Maybe they just felt it was a waste of time. Who knows? But that's it. All right, so now that's your example of a non-response bias, right? Non-response bias basically happens when so many people didn't respond that you don't have a big enough group of people to kind of make a decision as to what's going on. In this case, we found out 94% of the people didn't even respond to the survey. So that was a waste of our time. Okay? So now we can't say if his workers suck. So your homework right now is page 114, 1A, 2AD, and these, okay? And you're going to be given feedback on these questions. So if you have any questions, send me some messages and I'll help you out gladly. Have a good day.